Good morning, America. Today I want to continue talking about World War I. We're going to talk about trench warfare on the Western Front. Alright, so the First Battle of the Marne is the first big battle on the Western Front in World War I. And as a result of this battle, the Schlieffen Plan completely goes off the rails. Now, after the First Battle of the Marne, the Germans are forced to retreat. However, they don't go very far. They retreat just a little ways, and then they're like, well, this looks like a good spot. Let's make defensive positions here. And so they halt and form defensive positions and start to dig in. Before long, the French and the British Expeditionary Force, the BEEF, they come running up, and they're like, oh wow, the Germans are digging in and building defensive positions. We should do the same. So they start to do the same. Now, when I say defensive positions, what they do basically is dig trenches. Now, these trenches are relatively shallow, at least to start with, and not particularly deep or complex. They get more complex later. So the Germans start digging trenches, dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug. And then the Allies are like, wow, that's a good idea. Let's do the same thing. And so they start digging trenches. Dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug. Then the Germans are like, we need to dig more trenches. So dig, dug, dig, dug, they dig more. Then the Allies are like, I say, old chap, let's dig trenches that are longer than theirs so that we can go around behind them. So basically the idea is here, on one side, you have a line of trenches. These are the German trenches. And then you have, on the other side, you have a set of Allied trenches that are also being dug. The Allies have the idea, what if we dig our trenches farther than the Germans on each side? Then maybe we can dig around the edges of them and then flank them and sneak up on them like this. That was their idea. But the Germans see through this plan. They're like, aha, we see through your ploy. We will not allow you to do this. And so the Germans dig their trenches, as the Allies dig their trenches farther out on either side. Then, before you know it, the Germans are digging their trenches farther out on either side to keep from being flanked. And what happens next is possibly the world's first ever trench digging contest, where each side is digging their trenches out farther and farther and farther in each direction. Dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug, dig, dug, until before you know it, the Germans and the Allies have dug a system of trenches stretching all the way from the Channel coast, the coast of the English Channel, all the way to the border with Switzerland, which is a distance of hundreds of miles. And you have a parallel system of trenches. It's like if you, the distance here is just amazing. It's like if you dug a trench from here in Daytona Beach, Florida, all the way across Florida to Tampa, and then like halfway back again. That's how long the trench system is. And then they sit in those trenches, and they shoot at each other for 4 years. And that's trench warfare on the Western Front in a nutshell. And the way the trench warfare works is basically you've got guys in the trenches. The basic trench is a hole in the ground that keeps going in either direction. In terms of the depth of it, the most basic trenches, especially earlier in the war, they're dug to be about chest height for for a grown man. People back then were, on average, Europeans were a little bit shorter than we are today, so average height's a little shorter than me, or about my height. So, the trench depth would be up to about here. Now, later on in the war, they start digging them a little bit deeper so that people are actually, the top of the trench is actually above eye level. So later in the war, the trenches are more like about here. But anyway, they dig these trenches in either direction. The Germans are the star trench diggers of World War I. They have the best trenches, especially later in the war. Some of their trenches are reinforced with concrete. They build concrete bunkers into them. They have electricity and running water in some of their trenches even. Now, they didn't have a lot of food to eat, so they got to sit in their nice concrete bunkers and starve. But they had great trenches. The Allies' trenches were not nearly so fancy. The British trenches are okay, but not so great. The French trenches are the worst. The French trenches are a mess. Everybody makes fun of the French for having the worst trenches. Their trenches are just are a real mess. So the Allies, they don't have any reinforced concrete or anything. It's just dirt and maybe some wood and sandbags. And they'll dig holes called foxholes in the, which is basically a cave in the side of the trench that you hide in for to try to get a little bit of shelter from the elements. Life in the trenches is miserable. It's hot in the summer, but the biggest problem is that it's cold in the winter, because in northern Europe, pre-global warming, it gets really cold in the winter, and it rains a lot. The water turns to mud. They're standing there in the mud day after day. It's really miserable. But trench warfare is basically long periods of tedium punctuated by shorter periods of extreme terror. So you can have large sections of the Western Front where really nothing is happening. Basically, the two sides are just sitting there. There's really no active fighting going on. Maybe once in a while, a shot or two will ring out just to let everybody know that, yeah, we're still here and paying attention, but there's really no active fighting going on. But then in other areas of the front, you'll have the most ferocious battles going. Absolutely ferocious. And the fighting is just incredibly intense. Now, the area in between the trenches, this area here, this is no man. That marker is kaput. The area in between the trenches is called no man's land, because no man wants to be out there. No man's land, especially in areas where there's active fighting going on, is a wasteland. If there are any buildings out there, they've been destroyed. If there are any trees out there, they've been cut down by gunfire. Even the grass is gone, and it just gets churned up into a sea of mud, covered with tangles of barbed wire. Barbed wire rules the World War I battlefield. There's tangles of it everywhere. And then the whole thing is pockmarked by big craters caused by the artillery shells hitting. Then those craters fill up with water and turn into little lakes. People actually die of drowning on the Western Front because they fall into those shell holes full of water and they're weighed down by their equipment and they don't know how to swim, and then they're goners. So it's really just a totally alien landscape, and a very horrible one at that. The artillery dominates the World War I battlefield. The guns, they're more than just cannons at this point. They are big, they lob big shells filled with high explosives. One of these shells is coming in, you have about a 1 second warning, you hear a whistle, you know a shell is coming in, but you don't know exactly where it's going to land. A shell hits, and whatever was there is gone. Whether it was a building, or an animal, or a person, totally gone. Instead of whatever was there, there's now a hole in the ground. And then any soldiers around will immediately run and jump in that hole because they're suspicious and they think that if a shell lands there, and that means that a shell is not likely to land right in the same spot twice, so they'll go run and jump in the hole for shelter. Trench warfare on the Western Front is its own unique, special kind of terrible situation. Mostly boredom, punctuated by periods of extreme terror.